In picturesque Boulder, Colorado, a 59-year-old grandmother was about to discover her decades-long role as family photographer had rendered her invisible. What began as a heartbreaking revelation at a milestone celebration would spiral into a battle for recognition that would tear open wounds hidden beneath perfectly arranged family portraits. Margaret Lawson wasn't your typical overlooked relative. For 35 years, she'd been the dedicated matriarch who documented every birthday, graduation, and holiday with painstaking devotion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. When she encountered her family's stunning betrayal displayed in gilded frames, she had no idea she was confronting the culmination of years of systematic erasure. Margaret's fierce loyalty to preserving family memories would lead to her painful awakening to her own absence in the visual history she'd created. What began as shock would become a courageous journey to reclaim her rightful place in her family's story. Before we dive deeper, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The invitations for Margaret's 60th birthday celebration spread across her kitchen table like evidence in a trial she hadn't known she was facing. Cream-colored envelopes with gold embossing that her daughter-in-law Vanessa had insisted upon. Each one a reminder of the milestone Margaret wasn't sure she wanted to acknowledge. 60 years. 6 decades of building a life that suddenly felt strangely hollow when examined too closely. She pressed her reading glasses higher on her nose and reached for her planner, though she'd already memorized the details. 3 weeks until the party her children had insisted on throwing. A proper celebration, they called it, at the upscale mountain resort where her son Nathan worked as an events coordinator. The venue she couldn't have afforded on her teacher's pension, but that her children assured her was no trouble at all to secure with Nathan's employee discount. The silence of the house pressed against her ears. During her teaching years, there had been constant noise, the cheerful chaos of elementary school classrooms, parent-teacher conferences, school events that filled her evenings and weekends. Now the silence felt expectant, watchful. Even the antique wall clock in the hallway seemed to tick more loudly, counting down the seconds until she'd have to face the decision she'd been avoiding. Margaret picked up the guest list Vanessa had emailed yesterday, the one that had arrived with a cheerful note asking her to review and approve, though the deposit had already been paid and invitations sent. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her approval was a formality, just like her input on most family decisions these days. Margaret may have been the family matriarch, but somewhere along the way, her voice had become merely decorative, acknowledged but rarely heeded. She walked to the window above the kitchen sink, looking out at the garden she'd tended with such care. The rose bushes needed pruning. The vegetable patch was overrun with weeds. Everything was falling into a gentle state of neglect, just like her carefully ordered life. She'd been an elementary school teacher for 32 years, organized and efficient, the kind of woman who kept backup lesson plans for her backup plans. But no plan had prepared her for this kind of invisibility, this subtle sidling into irrelevance within her own family. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. She almost didn't answer. Too many calls these days were from telemarketers. Or, worse, her children with helpful suggestions about how she should be living her life. But something made her reach for the receiver. Mom? The voice hit her like a physical force. Ashley. Her youngest. The free spirit who'd moved to Seattle 5 years ago to pursue her art career and who rarely made it home for holidays. Ashley, her voice came out as a whisper. Is everything okay? Yeah, Mom. Everything's fine. Just calling to make sure you got the invitation to your birthday party. Nathan wasn't sure if the mail had reached you yet. The tears came without warning, hot and immediate. She'd spent months managing her expectations, telling herself it was fine that her children were busy with their own lives, that weekly phone calls had dwindled to occasional texts, that family gatherings now happened around her rather than with her. But hearing Ashley's voice broke something loose inside her chest. I got it, she managed. It looks very fancy. Vanessa's been planning for months. She wants it to be perfect. The resort is gorgeous, Mom. You're going to love it. Margaret closed her eyes, remembering all the birthdays she'd planned for her 3 children. The handmade decorations, the themed cakes she'd stayed up late to perfect, the carefully chosen gifts wrapped in paper that matched each child's current obsession. The effort she'd put into making them feel special, celebrated, seen. That's very thoughtful of her, Margaret said, the words catching slightly in her throat. So how are you doing, Mom? How's the house? Still keeping up with that huge garden? The questions were perfunctory, the tone suggesting Ashley was multitasking, probably scrolling through her phone or checking emails while making obligatory conversation. Margaret could almost hear the distraction in her daughter's voice. Everything's fine, she said, not wanting to burden her daughter with the truth that the garden was becoming overwhelming. That the two-story house felt too large for one person, that sometimes she went entire days without speaking to another human being. How's your art going? It's amazing, Mom. I just got a commission from a major tech company to create installations for their new headquarters. It's my biggest project yet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The excitement in Ashley's voice was genuine, and Margaret felt a surge of pride mixed with a tinge of sadness. Her daughter was thriving in a world Margaret barely understood, creating a life that had little room for regular calls home or visits to Colorado. That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. They chatted for a few more minutes, surface-level conversation that revealed little about either of their lives. Ashley promised to send photos of her latest work, though Margaret had heard that promise before. As they were about to hang up, Ashley added, "Oh, Mom, Vanessa wanted me to ask, can you bring your good camera to the party? She wants to make sure we get lots of great shots." The request landed like a stone in Margaret's stomach. Of course. Even at her own celebration, she would be expected to fulfill her usual role, the family photographer, capturing everyone else's joy while remaining absent from the visual record herself. "I thought Vanessa hired a professional photographer," Margaret said, remembering this detail from one of Nathan's earlier calls. "She did, but you know how you always get the best candid shots. No one captures the family like you do, Mom." The compliment, meant to be flattering, only twisted the knife deeper. Yes, she had documented every family milestone for decades, first with her trusty film camera and later with increasingly sophisticated digital equipment. Photography had been her passion outside of teaching, a way to create lasting memories. But it had also meant she was rarely in the photos herself. "I'll bring it," she said finally. After they hung up, Margaret sat in the silence of her kitchen, the weight of the realization pressing down on her shoulders. She was the chronicler of her family's history, not a participant in it. The invisible presence behind the lens, capturing moments she was never fully part of. She walked into her living room, where the evidence of this truth hung on every wall. The portrait gallery, as her late husband James had called it, a carefully arranged collection of framed photographs documenting their family's journey. Their 3 children growing from toddlers to teenagers to adults. Graduations, weddings, the births of 4 grandchildren. Holidays, vacations, celebrations spanning 3 decades. Margaret stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking in each image with new eyes. And there it was, the glaring absence she'd somehow never fully registered before. In nearly every photograph, someone was missing. Her. Out of dozens of framed memories, she appeared in perhaps 5 or 6, usually at the edge of the frame, often partially cut off, as if her presence was an afterthought. Even in the professional photos, the stiff, formal portraits taken at weddings or by mall photographers at Christmas, she was positioned oddly, sometimes almost hidden behind taller family members, as if the photographer had been given implicit instructions to minimize her presence. The most prominent wall featured the newest additions, photographs from last Christmas when the entire family had gathered at Nathan and Vanessa's home. Margaret had spent the day as she always did, camera in hand, moving from room to room. To capture the perfect shots of grandchildren opening presents, her children laughing together, the elaborate dinner Vanessa had prepared. At the center of this display was an enlarged photo in an ornate silver frame, what Vanessa called the official family portrait. It had been taken by a neighbor with Margaret's camera, a rare moment when she'd handed off the photography duties. The family had assembled in front of Nathan and Vanessa's Christmas tree, everyone dressed in coordinating outfits of burgundy and navy. Margaret leaned closer, her heart pounding with a realization that shouldn't have been shocking but somehow was. She wasn't in the photo. She remembered now, Vanessa had called her over to check if the composition looked right, to adjust little Emma's dress and straighten Tyler's tie. But then someone had needed help in the kitchen, a timer had gone off, and in the shuffle, the photo had been taken without her. "We'll take another with you in it," Nathan had promised. But they never had. And now this photo, this incomplete image, had been declared the official family portrait, enlarged, beautifully framed, and given pride of place in the collection. Margaret sank onto the sofa, her legs suddenly unable to support her. How had she not noticed this before? How had she accepted, for years, her gradual erasure from her family's visual history? Had she been so conditioned to be the observer, the documenter, that she'd forgotten her right to be a participant? Her eyes fell on another frame, this one containing a rare photo of her with James, taken on their 30th anniversary trip to Yellowstone. A stranger had offered to take it, and for once, they were both in the frame together, smiling, the grand prismatic spring a blur of colors behind them. James had died just 2 years later, a sudden heart attack that had upended her world. In the 7 years since his death, Margaret realized, her presence in family photos had diminished even further. As if without James to insist she hand over the camera occasionally, she had fully disappeared behind the lens. The party invitation still lay on the kitchen table, its gold embossing catching the afternoon light. 60 years. A celebration of her life. Yet the evidence on her walls suggested that life was seen as little more than a supporting role, a background presence that facilitated but didn't merit inclusion in the story. The practical part of her mind, the part that had managed classroom crises and family emergencies with equal calm, whispered that she was overreacting. Her children loved her. They were busy with their own lives. They didn't deliberately exclude her. It was just that she was always the one with the camera, the one who cared most about documenting these moments. But the woman in her, the one who had raised these children, who had built this family with love and sacrifice and constant presence, whispered warnings she wasn't sure she could afford to ignore any longer. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts before she could change her mind. The phone rang twice before a warm, familiar voice answered. "Margaret, I was just thinking about you this morning." "Diane," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Are you free for coffee tomorrow? There's something I need to talk about." Diane Porter had been her closest friend for over 30 years, the kind of friend who had seen her through James's death, empty nest syndrome, and the difficult transition to retirement. If anyone could help her make sense of this revelation, it would be Diane. "Of course. Sullivan's at 10? Our usual table?" After she hung up, Margaret walked back to the portrait wall, studying it with new eyes. Each photo told a story, but it wasn't the full story. It was a carefully curated version that, intentionally or not, minimized her role and presence in her own family. The party was 3 weeks away. Margaret had always prided herself on being the peacemaker, the one who accommodated everyone else's needs, who never made waves. But standing in her living room, surrounded by evidence of her own erasure, she felt something shifting inside her. This birthday, this milestone, wouldn't be just another occasion for her to stand behind the camera. Somehow, she would find a way to reclaim her place in the frame. She just wasn't sure yet what that would look like. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, marking the end of another day in which she discovered something profound about her life. Tomorrow, she would talk to Diane. Tomorrow, she would begin to formulate a plan. But tonight, as the sun set over the mountains visible from her living room window, Margaret Lawson sat alone with the uncomfortable truth that had been hanging on her walls all along. She had become invisible in the very family she had built, preserved, and documented with such loving care. The cafe was busy when Margaret arrived the next morning, the Saturday crowd filling the small space with cheerful conversation and the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee. Diane was already at their usual corner table, 2 steaming mugs waiting. After 30 years of friendship, Diane knew exactly how Margaret took her coffee, 1 sugar, splash of cream, in the blue ceramic mug that the owner kept specially for her longtime customers. "You look like you haven't slept," Diane said by way of greeting, her directness one of the qualities Margaret had always valued most about her friend. No polite fictions between them, just honest observation and genuine concern. "Is it that obvious?" Margaret slid into the chair across from Diane, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Only to someone who's known you since your perm phase in the 90s, Diane said with a smile that quickly faded to seriousness. "What's going on? Your call yesterday had me worried." Margaret took a deep breath and began to explain the upcoming birthday party, Ashley's call, and most importantly, her revelation about the family photos. As she spoke, she pulled out her phone and showed Diane several examples she'd photographed that morning: the Christmas portrait without her, the graduation photos where she was barely visible at the edges, the vacation images where she appeared in perhaps 1 out of 20 shots. "I know it sounds ridiculous," Margaret said, her voice low to avoid being overheard. "Most people would say I'm being oversensitive or looking for problems where none exist." Diane studied the images carefully, scrolling through with increasing concern on her face. When she looked up, there was no dismissal in her expression, only recognition and a flash of anger on Margaret's behalf. "It's not ridiculous at all," Diane said firmly. "This is a pattern, and it's troubling. Have you ever talked to your kids about this?" Margaret shook her head. "I never really noticed it before, not fully. I mean, I knew I was usually the one taking the pictures, but I didn't realize how completely I'd been erased from the visual record until yesterday. And now they want you to bring your camera to your own 60th birthday party," Diane said, the anger more evident now. "So you can continue this pattern of documenting everyone else while remaining invisible yourself." When Diane put it so bluntly, the situation seemed even more absurd, more hurtful. Margaret had spent decades nurturing her children, supporting their dreams, celebrating their achievements. She'd been the one they called in crises, the one who dropped everything to babysit when childcare fell through, the one who remembered every birthday and anniversary with thoughtful gifts and cards. And yet, somewhere along the way, she'd been relegated to the role of observer rather than participant. The family photographer instead of a family member worthy of being photographed. "What are you going to do about it?" Diane asked, always the one to push for action rather than mere reflection. "I don't know yet," Margaret admitted. "Part of me wants to confront them, to ask why I've been systematically excluded from these images. Another part worries I'll sound petty or self-centered if I make an issue of it." "Petty?" Diane's eyebrows shot up. "Margaret, this is about your literal existence being acknowledged in your family's history. There's nothing petty about wanting to be seen." Margaret nodded, grateful for the validation. "The party is in 3 weeks. I'm supposed to review the final guest list and menu choices with Vanessa this week. Perfect opportunity to bring it up," Diane suggested. "Show her what you showed me. Ask her directly why the official family portrait doesn't include you." The thought made Margaret's stomach clench with anxiety. Vanessa was not someone who handled criticism well. Her daughter-in-law prided herself on her perfect home, perfect children, and perfect social media presence. Any suggestion that she had been inconsiderate would likely be met with defensive denial. "I'm not sure a direct confrontation is the right approach," Margaret said slowly. "At least not yet. I need to think about this more." Diane reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. "Whatever you decide, I'm here for you. But don't let this go, Margaret. Don't swallow this hurt and pretend it doesn't matter. It matters." They spent the rest of the morning talking through options, from subtle approaches to dramatic gestures. By the time they parted with a long hug on the sidewalk outside the cafe, Margaret felt both emotionally drained and strangely energized. She had named the problem. She had shared it with someone who validated her feelings. Now she needed to decide how to address it. Back at home, Margaret found herself drawn back to the portrait wall. She studied each photo carefully, trying to remember the circumstances of each one. Who had suggested the composition? Who had decided which photos were worthy of framing and display? In the early years, when the children were small, James had often insisted she be in the pictures. "Get in there, Maggie," he'd say, taking the camera from her hands. "They need to see you were here too." After his death, those moments of insistence had vanished. No one had taken up the role of ensuring she was included. Margaret moved to her home office and began searching through digital folders on her computer. Thousands of images, meticulously organized by year and event. She clicked through them rapidly, confirming what she already suspected. In the digital archive, just as on her walls, she was a ghost, present perhaps in 5% of the images, despite being present at every event. On impulse, she opened her email and began a new message to all 3 of her children. She attached a photo from each of their weddings, beautiful, professional shots where she stood at the edge of the frame, partially hidden behind others despite her status as mother of the bride or groom. She typed a single line, "I've been thinking about my role in our family photos. Have you ever noticed anything about these images?" Her finger hovered over the send button, heart racing with the boldness of the question. Then, with a deep breath, she clicked, sending her small challenge out into the digital void. The responses came in throughout the afternoon, each one revealing in its own way. From Nathan, her eldest, "Not sure what you mean, Mom. They're nice photos. Is something wrong with them?" From Ashley, her youngest, "Sorry, super busy with this installation. Can we talk about this later?" From Emily, her middle child and usually the most perceptive, "Are you upset about something, Mom? The photos look fine to me. Is this about your birthday party? I told Nathan and Vanessa not to make it such a big production, but you know how they are." Not one of them had noticed her near absence in the images. Not one had registered the pattern she was trying to highlight. The invisibility was so complete that even when directly pointed out, they couldn't see it. Margaret leaned back in her chair, a strange calm settling over her. She had her answer. This wasn't a deliberate exclusion, which in some ways made it worse. Her absence had become so normalized that no one even questioned it anymore. She had been relegated to the role of documenter so completely that no one, not even her own children, thought to ensure she was included in the memories being preserved. That evening, as she prepared a simple dinner for herself, Margaret's phone rang again. It was Nathan, his tone concerned in a way that suggested Emily had spoken to him about her cryptic email. "Mom, is everything okay? Emily said you seemed upset about some old photos." Margaret took a deep breath, deciding in that moment to be direct. "I've been looking at our family photos, Nathan. The ones on my walls, the ones in albums, the ones on my computer. And I've noticed something disturbing. I'm barely in any of them. A pause. Well, you're usually the one taking the pictures, right? You've always been our family photographer. Yes, but don't you think it's strange that there's almost no visual evidence that I was present at the most important moments of our family's life? Including last Christmas's official family portrait that doesn't include me at all? Another, longer pause. Mom, that was just a mix-up. We were going to take another one with you, but then dinner was ready, and everyone got distracted. It wasn't just that photo, Nathan. It's a pattern going back years. Look at the photos from Emma's baptism, or Tyler's 5th birthday, or your promotion celebration. I was at all of those events, but looking at the photos, you'd never know it. I never really thought about it, Nathan admitted, his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. You've always been the one who cared most about taking photos. None of us are really into photography like you are. That's not the point, Margaret said, feeling frustration rise. The point is that I've been systematically excluded from our family's visual history. And now, for my own birthday celebration, I'm once again being asked to be the photographer rather than a participant. Mom, that's not fair. Vanessa hired a professional photographer for your party. She just thought you might want to bring your camera too, since you always have it with you anyway. Would you ask a professional chef to cook at their own birthday dinner? Margaret asked quietly. That's different, Nathan protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Think about how it feels, Nathan, to look at decades of family photos and barely see yourself in them. To realize that your presence has been reduced to the person behind the camera rather than a family member worthy of being included in the frame. The silence that followed told Margaret her words had finally landed. When Nathan spoke again, his voice was subdued. I never thought about it that way. I'm sorry, Mom. We should have been more conscious of this. Yes, you should have, Margaret agreed, not harshly but firmly. And that's why I don't want to bring my camera to the party. I want to be in the photos this time, Nathan. All of them. I want visual evidence that I was there, celebrating my own milestone. Of course, Nathan said quickly. I'll talk to Vanessa about making sure the photographer knows to focus on you. It is your celebration, after all. After they hung up, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, both drained and oddly exhilarated by the confrontation. It wasn't in her nature to assert herself this way, to demand recognition. But something about turning 60, about looking back on decades of family history and seeing her own absence, had sparked a determination she hadn't known she possessed. The call with Nathan had been a start, but Margaret knew it wasn't enough. This wasn't just about the upcoming party. It was about years of accumulated erasure, about reclaiming her place in her family's visual narrative. It was about being seen, truly seen, for perhaps the first time in decades. She glanced at the portrait wall visible from her kitchen, at the carefully arranged photos that told an incomplete story. And suddenly, she knew exactly what she needed to do next. The changes began so subtly that Margaret almost missed them. 2 days after her conversation with Nathan, she woke to the familiar chime of her cell phone, a text message lighting up the screen with an unexpected request. Hi Mom, it's Vanessa. Just wondering if you have any family photos with all of us. Together? Need one for the slideshow we're making for your party. Something where everyone looks good, especially you. Margaret stared at the message, its artificial cheeriness masking what felt like a belated acknowledgement of the issue she'd raised with Nathan. So he had spoken to Vanessa. But the request itself was telling, they needed her to locate the rare photos where she actually appeared, because they had finally realized how few existed. She set the phone down without responding, unsure whether to feel vindicated or more frustrated. The fact that they needed to ask her for photos that included her only underscored the problem. Later that morning, as Margaret watered her neglected garden, the full impact of her confrontation with Nathan began to unfold in her mind. For years, decades even, she had accepted her role as the invisible chronicler of her family's milestones. The one who ensured memories were preserved but who rarely appeared in them herself. What else had she accepted without question? What other ways had she allowed herself to become peripheral in her own life? The garden hose slipped from her hand, water spraying across the flagstone path. The metaphor wasn't lost on her, she had let control slip away so gradually she hadn't noticed until everything was soaked through with patterns too deep to easily change. Margaret spent the afternoon in her home office, surrounded by photo albums dating back to when her children were babies. The earliest albums told a different story. There she was, a young mother with 3 small children, appearing in countless photos taken by James. Her late husband had understood the importance of capturing her with their children, of ensuring the visual record reflected her presence and importance. After his death, the pattern had shifted dramatically. As if without his insistence, she had retreated fully behind the camera, becoming the eye that saw but was never seen. The doorbell rang, startling her from her archaeological dig through family history. She opened the front door to find Emily standing on the porch, a paper bag from Margaret's favorite bakery in her hands and an uncertain expression on her face. "Thought you might want some company," Emily said, holding up the bag. "And cinnamon rolls." Margaret stepped aside to let her daughter in, genuinely surprised by the unscheduled visit. Emily lived in Denver, a 40-minute drive away, and usually planned visits well in advance around her busy schedule as a hospital administrator. "What brings you all the way out here on a weekday?" Margaret asked as they settled at the kitchen table with coffee and the still-warm pastries. Emily picked at the edge of her cinnamon roll, avoiding eye contact. "Nathan called me about the photos. He said you were upset." "Not upset," Margaret corrected gently. "Awakened. There's a difference." Emily finally looked up, her expression a mixture of guilt and confusion. "I don't understand, Mom. You've always been the one who wanted to take the pictures. You're the one with the expensive camera and the perfect eye for composition. None of us can take photos half as good as yours." "That's not the point, Emily. The point is that I've been systematically erased from our family's visual history. I exist almost exclusively behind the lens, not in the images themselves." Emily's gaze drifted to the living room, where the portrait wall was visible from their seats at the kitchen table. "I never thought about it that way," she admitted. "But now that you mention it, it's pretty obvious." "It became obvious to me too, but only recently," Margaret said. "And it made me wonder what else I've missed, what other ways I've been sidelined in our family dynamics." Emily's face flushed slightly. "That's not fair, Mom. We include you in everything. We call you for advice, we invite you to all our events." "Do you?" Margaret asked quietly. "Last Thanksgiving, who decided where the celebration would be held?" "Well, Vanessa offered to host, and her house has the most space." "Christmas. Nathan and Vanessa again, but that's because they have the kids and all their Santa presents, so it's easier for everyone to go there." "And who decided the menu for each of those gatherings?" Emily shifted uncomfortably. "Vanessa enjoys planning those things. She's really good at it." "I used to enjoy planning those things too," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "I hosted every holiday for 30 years. I kept track of everyone's favorite dishes and made sure they were included. I created traditions that made each celebration special and meaningful. But after Dad died," Emily began. "After Dad died, everyone assumed I couldn't handle it anymore. That I needed to be taken care of rather than included in the decision-making. No one asked if I wanted to keep hosting. You all just decided for me." The truth of it hung in the air between them. Margaret could see the realization dawning on her daughter's face, the gradual way Margaret's role had shifted from matriarch to observer, from central figure to supporting character. It hadn't been malicious or deliberate, but it had happened. Nonetheless. "I'm sorry," Emily said finally. "We thought we were helping. Making things easier for you." "I know you did," Margaret acknowledged. "But in trying to help, you took away my agency. My voice. My presence. Until I became the woman who shows up when told, takes the photos as expected, and goes home with memories of everyone but herself." Emily reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "What can we do to fix this?" Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand, grateful for the genuine concern she heard in the question. "For starters, I'm not bringing my camera to the birthday party. I want to be in the photos this time, not just taking them." "Of course," Emily agreed quickly. "Vanessa already hired a photographer anyway. And I'd like to take down the portrait wall." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. "The whole thing? But you've spent years building that collection." "That's just it, I've spent years curating a visual history that systematically excludes me. Looking at it now feels like staring at evidence of my own erasure. I want to start fresh, with a new approach to documenting our family's story. One where everyone is included." Emily was silent for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what her mother was suggesting. The portrait wall had been a fixture in their family home for as long as she could remember, a physical manifestation of their shared history. "Would you let me help?" she asked finally. "Maybe this weekend? I could come back with some boxes and we could carefully take everything down, sort through what you want to keep, what you want to change." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. This was what she had hoped for, not just acknowledgement of the problem, but a willingness to actively participate in the solution. "I'd like that very much." As they finished their coffee and cinnamon rolls, the conversation shifted to the upcoming party. Emily revealed that Vanessa had indeed been planning a slideshow, a tribute to Mom's life, that was meant to be a surprise. She's been asking all of us for photos, Emily admitted. But I think she's realized there aren't many with you in them, especially from the last few years. That's probably why she texted you directly. Margaret nodded, the irony not lost on her. Tell her I'll look through what I have. But also tell her that my birthday wish is to be fully present at my own celebration, not as the photographer, not as a peripheral figure, but as the guest of honor who is seen and included. After Emily left, promising to return on Saturday to help with the portrait wall project, Margaret felt a curious lightness. The conversation had been difficult but necessary. For perhaps the first time in years, she had spoken her truth without softening it to spare others' feelings. She had named the pattern that had hurt her and asked directly for change. As the afternoon light slanted through her living room windows, illuminating the rows of frames that had unwittingly documented her absence, Margaret made a decision. She would begin the process now, on her own terms, before Emily arrived to help with the larger project. She started with the official family portrait from last Christmas, the one where she didn't appear at all. Carefully, she lifted it from its hook and placed it face down on the sofa. Then the professional photo from Nathan and Vanessa's wedding, where she stood awkwardly at the end of the line, partially obscured by the best man. Down it came. One by one, Margaret removed the most egregious examples of her erasure, the photos where her absence was most glaring or where her presence was so diminished as to be almost insulting. She didn't feel anger as she worked, just a steady resolve. This wasn't about punishing her family for their oversight. It was about refusing to continue participating in her own invisibility. By the time the sun set, casting long shadows across her living room, a dozen frames lay carefully stacked on her coffee table. The wall looked oddly patchy now, with empty spaces breaking up the remaining arrangement. But those empty spaces felt important somehow, visible evidence of her awakening, of her refusal to accept the status quo any longer. Margaret sat on her sofa, surveying her work. The practical part of her mind whispered that she was overreacting, making a mountain out of a molehill. Her children loved her. They hadn't deliberately excluded her. They were just busy with their own lives, their own perspectives. But the woman in her, the one who had spent decades nurturing this family, who had sacrificed and supported and shown up unfailingly for every milestone, whispered that she deserved better. She deserved to be seen, to be centered in her own life story, to exist in the visual record of her family's journey. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nathan. "Mom, Vanessa is freaking out because you haven't responded about the photos for the slideshow. Do you have any you can send?" Margaret studied the message, noting the absence of any reference to their earlier conversation about her concerns. It was as if that discussion had never happened, as if her awakening was an inconvenient blip that everyone hoped would pass quickly so they could return to the comfortable patterns they'd established. She typed her response carefully. "I'll look through my archives tomorrow. In the meantime, I've started taking down some of the photos from the portrait wall. I'd like all of you to help me create a new visual history, one where everyone in the family is properly represented." Nathan's response came quickly. "Taking down the portrait wall? Mom, why would you do that? Those photos mean so much to all of us." Margaret's fingers hovered over the screen as she considered how to respond. Finally, she typed, "They mean something different to me now. Come see for yourself if you'd like to understand. My door is always open." She set her phone aside, knowing that her message would likely trigger a flurry of concerned texts and calls between her children. They might even view her actions as drastic, perhaps even signs of emotional instability as she approached her 60th birthday. The thought made her smile wryly. How telling that her simple act of self-advocacy could be interpreted as a concerning departure from her usual accommodating self. The doorbell rang the next morning just after 9, startling Margaret as she was sorting through a box of older photos she'd found in the attic. She opened the door to find all three of her children standing on her porch, Nathan looking concerned, Emily slightly apologetic, and Ashley, who must have flown in from Seattle, appearing both jet-lagged and bewildered. "What's this about taking down the portrait wall?" Nathan asked without preamble as they filed into the house. Margaret closed the door behind them, her heart racing at this unexpected family summit. "I didn't realize my text would bring all of you here so quickly. I was already planning to fly in early for the party," Ashley said, though her expression suggested this wasn't entirely true. "When Nathan called about the portrait wall situation, I just moved my flight up a couple of days." Margaret led them into the living room, where the partially dismantled portrait wall was immediately visible. Empty spaces dotted the arrangement like missing teeth, while the removed frames still sat stacked on the coffee table, now joined by albums and loose photos Margaret had been sorting through. "Mom, what are you doing?" Nathan asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and alarm. "These photos represent our family history. A very specific version of that history, Margaret corrected gently. One where I exist primarily behind the camera, not as a visible member of the family. That's not true, Ashley protested, moving to examine the wall. You're in plenty of these photos. Am I? Margaret challenged. Look closely. Count. How many images include me versus how many don't? And in the ones where I do appear, notice my position, often at the edge, partially cut off, or posed awkwardly as if I was an afterthought. Her 3 children studied the wall in silence, their expressions shifting as they began to see what Margaret had finally recognized. It was Emily who spoke first, her voice quiet with realization. She's right. Look at this one from Tyler's graduation, Mom's barely visible behind Uncle Dave. And here, at my hospital award ceremony, she's cut off at the edge of the frame. And the Christmas portrait from last year isn't even here anymore because I wasn't in it at all, Margaret finished. Despite being present at the gathering, despite being the one who actually took most of the other photos from that day. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father that it made Margaret's heart ache momentarily. I still don't understand why you're taking them all down. Can't we just be more mindful going forward? Make sure you're included in future photos? This isn't just about future photos, Margaret explained, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her chest. It's about acknowledging that I've been systematically erased from our family's visual narrative. It's about recognizing that my role has been reduced to documenting everyone else's lives while my own presence has been minimized. But that's because you love photography, Ashley argued. You're always the first one to grab the camera. You're the one with the talent for composition and lighting. None of us can take photos as beautiful as yours. That may be true, Margaret acknowledged, but it doesn't explain why, on the rare occasions when I do hand over the camera, I'm still not properly included. It doesn't explain why, when professional photographers are present at weddings or other events, I'm positioned at the margins or sometimes forgotten entirely. The silence that followed was heavy with realization. Margaret could see her children processing her words, perhaps reviewing their own memories of family gatherings, seeing them through a new lens. So what happens now? Nathan asked finally. You take down all the photos and then what? Margaret moved to the coffee table and picked up a stack of prints she'd selected from her morning's sorting. Now we create a new visual history. One that more accurately reflects everyone's presence and importance in this family, including mine. She handed each of them several photos, images she had discovered in her archives where she was fully present, engaged with her children or grandchildren. Her face alight with the love and connection that had defined her role as mother and grandmother. Many were older, from when James was still alive and insisted she be in the frame. Some were casual snapshots taken by friends at gatherings. A few were rare selfies she'd attempted in recent years. I want these to be part of our visual history. Too, she said softly. I want evidence that I was here, fully present in your lives, not just the invisible hand holding the camera. Ashley studied the photos, her artistic eye noting details the others might miss. These are beautiful, Mom. You look so happy in them, so alive. Not like the stiff formal poses in some of the portraits on the wall. That's because these captured genuine moments, Margaret explained. Not performances for the camera. Emily looked up from the photos in her hands, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm so sorry, Mom. I never realized what we were doing. How we were making you invisible. It wasn't deliberate, Margaret assured her. But it was real. And now that I've seen it, I can't unsee it. I can't keep walking past that wall every day, confronting the evidence of my own erasure. Nathan, always the most practical of her children, gestured to the half-empty wall. So what's the plan? Take everything down and start over? Not exactly, Margaret said. I want to be more intentional about what we display and how. I want a mix of professional portraits and candid moments. I want photos that show all of us, not just you with your children, but me with my children. Not just carefully posed holiday portraits, but messy, joyful moments of real connection. Like a more authentic visual history, Ashley suggested, her artist's mind grasping the concept immediately. Exactly, Margaret nodded. And I want all of you to be part of creating it. To help me select images that tell our true story, not just the polished version we've been presenting. The conversation continued into the afternoon as they sorted through albums and boxes of photos, discovering forgotten moments and reconnecting with memories that had faded with time. They ordered pizza and spread out across the living room floor, surrounded by decades of family history being reassessed through new eyes. As the day progressed, Margaret noticed a shift in her children's engagement with the project. What had begun as a reluctant response to her apparent crisis had evolved into genuine enthusiasm for rediscovering their shared past. They laughed over fashion choices in old photos, grew misty-eyed at images of James with the children, and expressed surprise at finding moments they'd forgotten entirely. Most significantly, they began to see what Margaret had identified, the pattern of her absence or marginalization in the visual record, especially in the years following James's death. They found photos where she had clearly been cropped out, others where she was positioned so far at the edge that later framing had eliminated her entirely, and many events where she appeared in perhaps one image out of dozens. "It's like you've been haunting your own life," Ashley observed, comparing two photos from the same event, one showing everyone but Margaret, the other capturing her standing slightly apart, camera in hand. "Present but not really seen." "That's exactly how it's felt," Margaret admitted. "Like I became a ghost in my own family after your father died." By evening, they had completely dismantled the portrait wall. Empty hooks and faint outlines on the paint marked where frames had hung for years. But rather than feeling barren, the space felt full of possibility to Margaret, a blank canvas where a more truthful narrative could be constructed. As her children prepared to leave, each taking assigned tasks for the portrait wall reinvention project, Margaret felt a profound shift in the family dynamic. For the first time in years, perhaps even decades, she had demanded to be seen, not just noticed, but truly seen in all her complexity and importance. And rather than rejecting her awakening, her children had ultimately embraced it, recognizing the truth in her perspective once they allowed themselves to see through her eyes. Nathan, the last to leave, paused at the door. "I'm sorry, Mom. We should have been more aware." "It's not about blame," Margaret assured him. "It's about awareness and change. About ensuring that going forward, no one in this family is relegated to the margins of our shared story." He hugged her tightly, this son who towered over her now but who once had fit perfectly in the crook of her arm. "We'll do better," he promised. "Starting with your birthday celebration." After they had all gone, Margaret stood alone in her living room, surveying the empty wall that had once displayed a carefully curated version of her family's history. The blank space represented not loss but opportunity, the chance to rewrite her role in her own life, to reclaim her visibility and voice. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, marking not just the hour but a profound turning point in Margaret's journey. For decades, she had documented everyone else's milestones while allowing her own presence to fade into the background. But as she approached her 60th birthday, she had finally found the courage to step out from behind the camera and demand her rightful place in the frame. The sunshine streamed through Margaret's living room windows, illuminating the empty wall where the portrait gallery had once hung. 3 days had passed since her children had helped dismantle the visual history that had documented her absence. The blank space felt both unsettling and liberating, like the pause between exhaling and inhaling, a moment pregnant with possibility. Margaret sipped her morning coffee, studying the wall with the critical eye of an artist considering a fresh canvas. Today was the day they would begin rebuilding, not just hanging frames but reconstructing a narrative that more accurately reflected her place within her family. Ashley and Emily were coming at 10, bringing frames they had selected from a local art store. Nathan would join them later with prints he'd had made from digital files Margaret had selected. The doorbell rang precisely at 10. When Margaret opened the door, she found not just Ashley and Emily but Diane as well, her oldest friend grinning as she balanced a bakery box in one hand. "Hope you don't mind the addition," Diane said, holding up the box. "I brought sustenance for the portrait wall revolution." "The more hands, the better," Margaret replied, genuinely pleased to have her friend's support on this significant day. They gathered around the kitchen table, where Ashley unrolled large sheets of paper covered in sketches and diagrams. "I've been thinking about this project as a visual narrative," she explained, her professional artist's training evident in the thoughtful composition she'd created. Not just a random collection of photos, but a deliberate story told through images. Margaret leaned closer, surprised and touched by how seriously her daughter had taken the assignment. The design featured clusters of photos arranged thematically rather than chronologically, with space for new images to be added over time. "I love the concept," Margaret said, tracing the outline of what would become the central grouping. "It feels dynamic, growing, like our family itself." "That's exactly what I was going for," Ashley beamed. "And look here, I've created space for quotes and small mementos, not just photos. I thought we could include some of Dad's favorite sayings, maybe that poem you wrote for your 30th anniversary. The thoughtfulness of the design brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. This wasn't just about correcting her absence in family photos. It was about creating a richer, more nuanced representation of their shared history, one that honored connections beyond just visual documentation. Emily unpacked the frames they'd selected, a varied collection in different sizes and finishes, more eclectic than the matching frames that had previously dominated the wall. "I thought these would work better with Ashley's design," she explained. "Less formal, more organic." And the variety means we can add to it over time without everything having to match perfectly. As they sorted through frames and began selecting photos for each position on the wall, Margaret found herself sharing stories her children had never heard, the context behind certain images, moments that had preceded or followed the captured scene. It was as if the act of physically reconstructing their visual history had opened a channel for verbal history as well. "I never knew Dad proposed to you twice," Ashley said, wide-eyed after Margaret recounted the story behind a newly discovered photo of their engagement. "The first time was so poorly planned that I told him to try again when he'd put more thought into it," Margaret laughed. "He was so nervous he forgot everything he wanted to say, and then the ring fell into a storm drain." "That's not in any of our family stories," Emily protested. "How have we never heard this?" Margaret considered the question, realizing that somewhere along the way, she had stopped being the narrator of their family history. The official version had become condensed, polished, edited for public consumption, largely by Vanessa's careful curation on social media and in family gatherings. "I think we stopped telling the messy stories," she said thoughtfully. "The ones that don't fit neatly into a perfect family narrative. But those are often the most important ones. The ones that show our humanity and resilience." Diane nodded in agreement. "That's what I've always loved about your family, Margaret. The real stories behind the picture-perfect moments. Remember when the Christmas tree fell over during the children's pageant, and James just propped it back up with all the ornaments still hanging sideways?" The memory sparked a round of stories they had nearly forgotten, the disasters that became beloved family legends, the unplanned moments that revealed character and created bonds stronger than any post-portrait could capture. By the time Nathan arrived with the new prints, the mood in the house had transformed from a somber restoration project to a joyful reclamation of their authentic history. He entered to find them laughing over an album from the early 1990s, teasing each other about unfortunate fashion choices and embarrassing haircuts. "Looks like I missed the fun part," he observed, setting down a large envelope filled with photographs. "Not at all," Margaret assured him. "We're just getting started." With the new prints added to their collection, they began the process of arranging and hanging the reinvented portrait wall. Ashley's design guided them, but the project evolved organically as they worked, with certain images demanding more prominent placement and new groupings emerging that hadn't been part of the original plan. Most importantly, Margaret was no longer relegated to the margins. Photos where she appeared, truly appeared, centered and engaged, formed the foundation of the new arrangement. Images of her with James, with each child, with combinations of family members throughout the decades. Even recent photos they had discovered where she had briefly handed off her camera to someone else, capturing rare moments when she stepped out from behind the lens. As the afternoon progressed, the empty wall gradually transformed. What emerged wasn't just a collection of family photographs but a visual memoir, more honest, more inclusive, and paradoxically more beautiful in its authenticity than the carefully curated display it replaced. "I wish Dad could see this," Emily said softly as they stepped back to assess their work. "He would love it." "He can see it," Margaret replied with quiet certainty. "And yes, he would approve. He always wanted our real story told, not just the perfect version." By late afternoon, the project was nearly complete. The new portrait wall told a different story than its predecessor, not of a perfect family where everyone knew their place and played their role, but of a messy, loving, evolving collection of individuals connected by blood and choice and shared history. Most significantly, it told the story of a mother who was fully present, not just as the chronicler but as an essential participant in the family's journey. As Emily and Ashley packed up the remaining supplies and Diane prepared to leave, Nathan pulled Margaret aside. "Mom, I need to tell you something about the party." Margaret felt a flicker of concern at his serious expression. "Is there a problem?" "Not exactly." He hesitated. "It's about Vanessa. She's been struggling with the changes you've been making. She had a very specific vision for your birthday celebration, and she feels like it's being derailed." Margaret sighed, not entirely surprised. Vanessa had always been the family's unofficial social director, planning gatherings with precision and expecting everyone to follow her carefully orchestrated script. What specifically is bothering her? "Well, the slideshow for one thing. She'd already started creating it, focusing on your role as grandmother, teacher, community volunteer. Then suddenly you're sending all these additional photos and talking about being properly represented in the visual narrative. And that's a problem because..." Nathan shifted uncomfortably. "She feels like you're taking over, changing the story she wanted to tell about you." The irony of the statement was so perfect that Margaret couldn't help but laugh. "I'm taking over my own birthday celebration? Changing the story someone else wanted to tell about my life?" Nathan had the grace to look embarrassed. When you put it that way, it does sound ridiculous. It sounds exactly like what's been happening for years, Margaret corrected gently. Other people determining how my story should be told, where I should be positioned, how I should be represented. Vanessa is just more direct about it than most. What should I tell her? Margaret considered the question carefully. This wasn't just about a birthday party or a slideshow. It was about the larger pattern of her gradual erasure from her own narrative, a pattern that would continue unless she clearly established new boundaries. Tell her I appreciate all her hard work planning the celebration, Margaret said finally. But also tell her that I expect to be consulted about how my life is presented. The slideshow should reflect my whole journey, not just the supporting roles I've played in other people's stories, but my own story as well. My career, my passions, my friendships, my marriage, my growth as an individual. Not just as a mother or grandmother or community volunteer, but as Margaret Lawson, complete person. Nathan nodded slowly. I'll tell her. Though she might not take it well. That's okay, Margaret said with newfound confidence. Part of reclaiming my story is accepting that not everyone will like the authentic version as much as they enjoyed the edited one. After everyone had left, Margaret stood alone before the transformed portrait wall, taking in the new visual narrative they had created together. It wasn't perfect, some photos were slightly crooked, some frame combinations didn't quite match, some spaces remained intentionally empty for future editions. But its very imperfection made it more truthful, more representative of the messy, beautiful reality of family life. Her phone chimed with a text from Vanessa. Nathan told me about your concerns with the slideshow. Maybe we should meet to discuss your vision for the party? Coffee tomorrow? Margaret studied the message, noting the careful phrasing that suggested compromise while still positioning Vanessa as the authority on the celebration. 6 months ago, even 6 days ago, she might have acquiesced, grateful to be included in the planning at all. But something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of her own worth and right to self-determination. She typed her response deliberately. I'd love to meet. How about my house at 10? I can show you the new portrait wall we created today. It might help you understand the complete story I want represented at the celebration. Vanessa's reply came quickly. Your house at 10 works. Looking forward to seeing the changes you've made. Margaret set down her phone, smiling slightly at the diplomatic response. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges as she navigated this new territory of self-advocacy with her daughter-in-law. But tonight, standing before the visual evidence of her reclaimed presence in her family's narrative, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, its familiar voice a reminder of continuity amid change. Margaret traced the outline of a newly framed photo at the center of the arrangement, an image taken just last year at Emily's birthday dinner. Someone had captured Margaret mid-laugh, her face alight with joy as she leaned toward her daughter. It wasn't a perfect photo by technical standards, slightly blurry, the composition off-center, but it captured something essential about her that the more formal portraits never had. It showed her fully present. Fully alive, fully herself. This was the beginning of her reclamation project, not just of her place in family photos, but of her voice, her presence, her centrality in her own life. The empty spaces on the wall represented not absence but possibility, room for new memories, new configurations, new understandings of what family meant and how it could be represented. Vanessa arrived precisely at 10 the next morning, dressed in what Margaret recognized as her professional meeting outfit, tailored slacks, silk blouse, subtle jewelry. Her daughter-in-law had approached this conversation as she did all potentially difficult interactions, with careful preparation and strategic presentation. The house looks different, Vanessa observed as Margaret led her into the living room where coffee and pastries waited. Her eyes immediately found the transformed portrait wall, studying it with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. That's because it is different, Margaret replied, gesturing toward the seating area. A lot has changed in the past week. They settled with their coffee, the portrait wall visible from where they sat, a silent participant in the conversation that followed. Nathan told me you've been feeling overlooked in family photos, Vanessa began carefully. I had no idea you felt that way. Margaret appreciated the neutral phrasing, the absence of dismissal in her daughter-in-law's tone. It wasn't something I fully recognized myself until recently, she acknowledged. But once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. And that's why you took down the portrait wall? Because you weren't in enough of the photos? There was a hint of incredulity in the question that Margaret might have once accommodated by minimizing her concerns. But not today. I took down the portrait wall because it told an incomplete and fundamentally dishonest story about our family, she said firmly. It presented a narrative where I existed primarily as the documenter rather than as an essential participant in our shared history. Vanessa's eyebrows rose slightly at the directness of the response. I see. I hope you do, Margaret continued. Because this isn't just about photos, Vanessa. It's about a pattern that's developed over years, one where my role has been reduced to observer and supporter rather than central figure in my own life. That was never intentional, Vanessa protested. We all value you enormously. I believe you, Margaret said gently. But intention and impact are different things. And the impact has been that I've gradually been erased from my own narrative. Vanessa was silent for a moment, her gaze moving between Margaret and the reinvented portrait wall. Is this why you've been sending all those additional photos for the slideshow? The ones of you when you were younger, before you had children? Yes. Because my story didn't begin when I became a mother or grandmother. I had 30 years of life before that, as a daughter, a student, a young professional, a woman falling in love. Those chapters matter too. Of course they do, Vanessa agreed, though her tone suggested she was still struggling to fully understand Margaret's perspective. I just thought the focus should be on your role in the family, since that's who will be at the party. And that's exactly the issue, Margaret said. My role in the family is important, but it's not the totality of who I am. When the slideshow presents only that aspect of my life, it reinforces the idea that my value lies solely in what I've done for others, not in who I am as a complete person. Vanessa set down her coffee cup, her expression thoughtful. I never considered it that way. I thought I was honoring you by focusing on all you've done for the family. I know, Margaret acknowledged. And I appreciate the intention behind it. But as I approach 60, I'm realizing how much of myself I've set aside to fulfill those family roles. How much of my own story has gone untold because it didn't fit neatly into the narrative of mother and grandmother. So what would you like to see in the slideshow instead? The question was genuine, without the defensive edge that had colored Vanessa's earlier responses. Margaret felt a surge of hope that real understanding might be possible. I'd like to see my whole journey represented, she explained. My childhood in Minnesota, my college years when I was determined to become a civil rights attorney before discovering my passion for teaching, my travels through Europe after graduation, my life with James before we had children. And yes, all the family milestones too, but with me fully present in the images, not just as the shadow behind the camera. Vanessa nodded slowly. I can work with that. Actually, it would make for a more interesting presentation anyway, more depth, more dimension to the story. Exactly, Margaret smiled. A more authentic representation of a real life, with all its complexity and evolution. As they continued talking, moving from the slideshow to other aspects of the upcoming celebration, Margaret observed a subtle shift in Vanessa's engagement. What had begun as a diplomatic meeting to manage a potential problem had evolved into a genuinely collaborative conversation about how to honor Margaret's life journey. I'm curious about something, Vanessa said as they were finishing their coffee. What made you notice this pattern now, after all these years? Margaret considered the question carefully. I think turning 60 triggered a kind of life review. I started looking back, assessing what matters, what I want the next chapter to look like. And when I really looked at how I've been represented in our family's visual history, I realized I'd been allowing myself to fade into the background. Allowing? Vanessa echoed. Yes, allowing, Margaret confirmed. I can't place all the responsibility on others. I handed over the camera willingly. I stepped back from hosting holidays when you offered. I accepted my gradual marginalization. Because it seemed easier than asserting my continued importance. That's remarkably self-aware, Vanessa said, sounding genuinely impressed. It's necessary, Margaret replied. Because recognizing my own part in this pattern is what gives me the power to change it. I can't control how others see me or represent me, but I can control whether I accept that representation as the final word on who I am. After Vanessa left, promising to rework the slideshow with Margaret's full journey in mind, Margaret returned to the living room and stood before the portrait wall once more. The conversation had gone better than she'd expected, with Vanessa showing a capacity for understanding that Margaret hadn't anticipated. But more important than Vanessa's response was the clarity Margaret herself had gained through articulating her journey. This wasn't about blame or resentment. It was about reclamation of her story, her presence, her right to be fully seen and acknowledged. As she studied the newly arranged photos, Margaret noticed details she had missed during the installation. The way certain images spoke to each other across time, the visual echoes between photos of different generations, the through lines of personality and connection that were now visible in this more authentic representation of family history. In the center of the arrangement, she had placed a photo that captured what she was fighting for, an image of 3 generations of women in her family, her mother, herself, and Emily, their faces alight with the same smile, their connection palpable even in a static image. It was a reminder that visibility mattered not just for her own sake but for the generations that would follow, the daughters and granddaughters who would learn from her example what it meant to claim space and voice in their own stories. The portrait wall was still evolving, with spaces intentionally left for future editions. But unlike its predecessor, this visual narrative would not allow Margaret to disappear. It established her presence as essential, her perspective as central, her journey as worthy of documentation and celebration. As the afternoon light shifted across the wall, highlighting different images in its warm glow, Margaret felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the physical rearrangement of photographs. She had begun the process of rewriting her role in her family's story, not as the invisible chronicler but as a fully dimensional protagonist in her own right. The upcoming birthday celebration would be a test of this new narrative, an opportunity to embody the visibility she had claimed in the portrait wall. But regardless of how others responded, Margaret had already achieved something profound. She had recognized her own erasure and refused to participate in it any longer. She had reclaimed her right to be seen, to be centered, to be fully present in the story of her own life. The grandfather clock chimed 4 times, marking not just the hour but a significant milestone in Margaret's journey towards self-reclamation. With each resonant tone, she felt more certain of the path she had chosen, not just for her 60th birthday celebration, but for all the years that would follow. The ballroom of the Mountain View Resort glowed with the soft amber light of hundreds of tiny bulbs strung across the vaulted ceiling. Margaret paused at the entrance, taking in the scene that had been arranged in her honor. Round tables draped in ivory linens formed a semicircle around a small dance floor. At the far end of the room, a projection screen stood ready for the slideshow Vanessa had reworked under Margaret's guidance. A trio of musicians played quiet jazz in the corner, their melodies creating an elegant soundtrack for the gathering. "Ready, Mom?" Emily appeared at her side, offering her arm with a smile that reflected genuine excitement rather than the dutiful cheerfulness that had characterized so many family gatherings in recent years. Margaret smoothed the silk of her emerald dress, a color she had chosen deliberately for its boldness, a departure from the muted tones she typically wore. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, taking her daughter's arm. The past week had been a whirlwind of preparations. Not just for the party but for the psychological journey it represented. After her conversation with Vanessa, Margaret had made other small but significant changes to the celebration plans. She had requested specific songs that held meaning for her rather than allowing the generic playlist Vanessa had originally proposed. She had chosen the menu items herself, incorporating dishes that reflected her Minnesota roots and her travels through Europe. She had even arranged for a photographer who understood her specific request, that she be centered in the visual documentation of this milestone, not relegated to the periphery. As they entered the ballroom, a ripple of awareness moved through the gathering. Conversations paused as heads turned toward the guest of honor. Margaret felt a moment of self-consciousness under the collective gaze, but she straightened her shoulders and smiled with genuine pleasure at the faces of friends and family who had come to celebrate with her. Nathan approached first, handsome in his charcoal suit, his expression a mixture of pride and something else, perhaps a new awareness of his mother as more than just the supportive background figure she had been for so long. "You look beautiful, Mom," he said, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "The color suits you." "Thank you, honey. Is everyone here?" "Just about. We're only missing Uncle Paul and his family. Their flight from Chicago was delayed, but they should arrive soon." Margaret nodded, scanning the room with a teacher's practiced eye for details. Her gaze landed on the photo display Vanessa had arranged near the entrance, a curated selection from the new portrait wall, augmented with additional images that told the story of Margaret's 60 years. Unlike previous family gatherings, where photos of Margaret had been scarce or marginalized, these images placed her firmly at the center of her own narrative, from childhood in Minnesota through college years, early teaching career, marriage to James, motherhood, and her evolution into the woman who stood confidently in the ballroom tonight. "What do you think?" Vanessa appeared beside them, gesturing toward the display. "I tried to follow the spirit of what we discussed." Margaret studied the arrangement, noting the thoughtful selection that balanced her various life roles without diminishing any of them. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. "Thank you for understanding what I was trying to express." Vanessa's smile held a new warmth, perhaps born of their recent conversations. "I think I finally get it. This is your story, all of it, not just the parts that involve us." The insight was so perfectly articulated that Margaret felt a rush of emotion. "Exactly," she managed, touching Vanessa's arm in genuine appreciation. The next hour passed in a blur of greetings and conversations as Margaret moved through the room, reconnecting with friends and family members who had traveled from across the country to celebrate with her. Unlike previous gatherings where she had often found herself on the edges of social interactions, tonight she was truly the center of gravity, not just in title as the guest of honor, but in the authentic engagement of everyone present. She found herself in conversations that went beyond the surface pleasantries that had characterized so many family events. Friends from her teaching days shared memories of classroom triumphs and challenges. Cousins reminisced about childhood. Summers at the lake cabin in Minnesota. Even her grandchildren seemed to see her with new eyes, asking questions about her life before she became a grandma, questions that suggested they were beginning to recognize her as a person with a full, complex history of her own. As dinner was about to be served, Ashley approached with the resort's photographer in tow. "Mom, we want to get some formal photos while the light is still perfect. Can you come with us for a few minutes?" Margaret followed them to a terrace overlooking the mountains, where the setting sun cast everything in a golden glow. The photographer, a woman about Emily's age with an easy, professional manner, positioned Margaret in the center of the frame, with the mountains as a stunning backdrop. "Beautiful," the photographer murmured, adjusting her lens. "Now, let's get some with your children." Nathan, Emily, and Ashley arranged themselves around Margaret, not with her pushed to the edge or partially hidden behind taller family members, but with her clearly positioned as the central figure in the composition. The photographer took several shots, then suggested variations with different combinations of family members. Throughout the process, Margaret noticed a distinct difference in how the photographer engaged with her compared to previous family photo sessions. There were no awkward attempts to minimize her presence or position her where she would be less prominent. Instead, the woman treated Margaret as the natural focal point, directing the composition to highlight rather than diminish her. "One more," the photographer said as the formal session was winding down. "Mrs. Lawson, just you alone, if you don't mind." Margaret hesitated only briefly before stepping forward, allowing herself to be photographed individually, something she had rarely permitted in the past, always more comfortable documenting others than being documented herself. "Perfect," the photographer said after capturing several frames. "You're a natural." "Hardly," Margaret laughed. "I've spent decades on the other side of the lens." "Well, you belong in front of it too," the woman replied with professional certainty. "You have a presence that translates beautifully to film." The simple validation from a stranger struck Margaret unexpectedly. How long had it been since someone had seen her, truly seen her, as worthy of being captured, preserved, centered in the frame? The realization of how thoroughly she had internalized her own invisibility made her throat tighten with emotion. Back in the ballroom, dinner was being served as twilight deepened outside the wall of windows. Margaret found herself at the head table with her children and their spouses, her 4 grandchildren seated at the adjacent table with cousins of similar ages. The arrangement allowed her to be part of the children's enjoyment while still engaging in adult conversation, a thoughtful detail she suspected Emily had orchestrated. As the meal progressed, Margaret observed the dynamic around her with new awareness. Conversations flowed naturally, with no one person dominating. Her opinions were sought and her stories listened to with genuine interest. Even Vanessa, who had often unconsciously directed family gatherings according to her own vision, seemed more attuned to creating space for others' voices, particularly Margaret's. After the main course had been cleared and before dessert was served, Nathan stood and tapped his glass for attention. "If I could have everyone's attention for a few minutes," he called out, his voice carrying easily through the room. "As many of you know, we've prepared a special presentation to celebrate my mother's 60 years. The lights dimmed, and the projection screen at the front of the room illuminated with the first image, a black and white photograph of Margaret as a baby in her mother's arms, both of them smiling into the camera with identical expressions. "Margaret Elizabeth Lawson," Nathan began, his voice warm with affection. "Born June 12, 1965, in Rochester, Minnesota, to Elizabeth and Harold Briggs." What followed was not the predictable chronological march through family milestones that Margaret had expected, but rather a thoughtfully structured journey through the many dimensions of her life. The narration, shared between Nathan, Emily, and Ashley, revealed a depth of research and insight that suggested they had truly engaged with understanding their mother's complete story, not just the parts that intersected with their own lives. They spoke of her childhood dreams of becoming an astronaut, her teenage rebellion that took the form of organizing student protests against unfair school policies, her college years where she discovered both her passion for education and her talent for photography. They shared stories of her early teaching career, where she had pioneered innovative approaches to engaging struggling readers, earning recognition from the state education board. The presentation moved through her marriage to James, their early adventures before children came along, and then into the years of parenthood, but always with Margaret portrayed as an active protagonist rather than merely a supporting character. In her children's stories, the images selected showed her engaged, centered, fully present, many from the archives she had recently rediscovered, others contributed by friends and relatives who had captured moments Margaret herself had missed. While behind the camera, most moving were the segments that addressed the years following James's death, a period Margaret had experienced as a gradual fading into the background of family life. The narrative acknowledged this transition with a sensitivity that brought tears to her eyes. After Dad died, Emily's voice explained over images of Margaret in the years following her husband's passing. Mom continued to be our family's foundation, our memory keeper, our constant support. But somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing her complete self. We allowed her to become the chronicler rather than the central character in her own story. The screen showed a series of photos that illustrated the pattern Margaret had identified, images where she appeared only at the margins, or not at all despite being present at the event. The visual evidence of her gradual erasure was powerful, causing murmurs of recognition throughout the room. But recently, Ashley's voice continued, Mom helped us see what we had been missing. She reminded us that her story didn't end when Dad died, or when we grew up, or when grandchildren came along. Her journey continued, evolving into new chapters that deserved to be witnessed and celebrated just as much as the earlier ones. The final sequence showed images from the past week, Margaret and her children reconstructing the portrait wall, Margaret in animated conversation with Vanessa over coffee, Margaret gardening with her granddaughter Emma, teaching the child how to prune roses just as her own mother had taught her decades earlier. The last image faded in slowly, a photograph taken just that afternoon during the formal portrait session. Margaret stood alone against the backdrop of mountains, her emerald dress catching the golden light, her face alight with a confidence and presence that seemed to radiate from the screen. Mom, Nathan's voice concluded as the image filled the screen, thank you for teaching us to see you, truly see you, in all your complexity and beauty. Happy 60th birthday to a woman who is not just the photographer of our family's story, but one of its most vibrant and essential characters. As the lights came up, Margaret found herself surrounded by applause, the entire gathering on their feet in a standing ovation that felt like a collective acknowledgement of her reclaimed visibility. She stood to embrace her children, tears flowing freely now, too moved for words. The celebration continued with dessert and dancing, but the slideshow had transformed the energy in the room. Friends and relatives approached Margaret throughout the evening with new perspectives on her life journey, sharing memories she had forgotten and insights she had never considered. It was as if the presentation had given everyone permission to see her more completely, to engage with the full spectrum of who she was rather than the limited role she had been assigned in recent years. Late in the evening, as the party was beginning to wind down, Margaret found a quiet moment alone on the terrace where the formal photos had been taken hours earlier. The mountains were dark silhouettes now against a star-filled sky, the June air cool but not uncomfortable. There you are, Diane's voice came from behind her. I've been looking for you. Margaret turned to find her oldest friend approaching with 2 champagne flutes. Just needed a moment to catch my breath, she explained, accepting the offered glass. It's been quite a night. That it has, Diane agreed, leaning against the terrace railing beside her. How does it feel to be the star of your own story for a change? Margaret considered the question, sipping her champagne as she gathered her thoughts. Unfamiliar, she admitted. But right, somehow. Like I've been wearing shoes that were slightly too small for years, and suddenly I have room to spread my toes. Diane laughed at the analogy. That's exactly it. You've been containing yourself, making yourself smaller to fit the space others allocated to you. Now you're claiming your full size. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, looking out at the darkened landscape. Finally, Diane spoke again, her voice gentle with affection. You know what I loved most about that slideshow? It wasn't just that it showed you in all your dimensions. It was that it acknowledged the erasure before celebrating the reclamation. Your kids didn't pretend they hadn't been part of the problem, they owned it and then showed how they're working to correct it. That's rare. It is, Margaret agreed, feeling a surge of pride in her children's capacity for growth and self-reflection. They really listened when I finally spoke up. Not just heard the words, but actually understood what I was trying to express. That's because you spoke your truth without apology, Diane observed. No cushioning, no minimizing, just the honest reality of your experience. It's harder to dismiss that kind of clarity. Inside the ballroom, the musicians began playing What a Wonderful World, the song Margaret and James had danced to at their wedding reception 35 years earlier. The melody drifted out to the terrace, wrapping around the two women like a memory-given voice. James would be proud of you, Diane said softly. He always hated it when you downplayed your importance or stepped out of the frame. Remember how he used to insist on taking the camera from you at family gatherings? Margaret nodded, throat tight with emotion. He would say, "Get in there, Maggie. They need to see you were here too." He was right, Diane said. And now you're making sure of it yourself. As they returned to the ballroom for the final dances of the evening, Margaret found herself surrounded by her grandchildren, all clamoring for her attention. 8-year-old Emma, Nathan's youngest, tugged at her hand with particular insistence. "Grandma, I have a present for you," she announced, producing a small package wrapped in glittery paper. Margaret unwrapped it, carefully to reveal a small digital camera, not a toy, but a real point-and-shoot model designed for beginners. "It's for me to take pictures," Emma explained earnestly. "Daddy says you're always the one with the camera, so I should learn to take pictures too. That way you can be in them more." The simple gift, offered with such innocent understanding of the deeper issue at hand, moved Margaret profoundly. Here was evidence that the pattern could be broken, that the next generation might grow up with a different understanding of how family history should be documented and who deserved to be centered in the visual narrative. "That's a wonderful idea," Margaret told her granddaughter, kneeling to her level despite the elegant dress. "Maybe we can learn together. You can teach me how to use this new digital model, and I can teach you some tricks I've learned over the years." Emma nodded solemnly, pleased with the proposed collaboration. "And I'll make sure you're in lots of pictures, Grandma. Right in the middle where everyone can see you." "Right in the middle," Margaret echoed, hugging her granddaughter close. "That sounds perfect." As the celebration drew to a close near midnight, Margaret found herself at the center of a final formal photograph, surrounded by children, grandchildren, siblings, cousins, and friends who had witnessed her journey in various ways over the decades. The resort photographer directed the large group with professional efficiency, but Margaret noticed how the woman consistently maintained her as the focal point of the composition, never allowing her to drift toward the margins. "Everyone look at Mrs. Lawson," the photographer instructed as she prepared for the final shot. "She's our star tonight." The simple direction, spoken casually as part of the professional process, crystallized everything Margaret had been fighting for. Not to be the star always, not to dominate every frame, but to be acknowledged as central to her own life story, worthy of being seen, recorded, remembered as more than just the woman behind the camera. After the final goodbyes had been said and the last guests had departed, Margaret stood in the empty ballroom with her 3 children, surrounded by the evidence of the celebration, gift boxes stacked on a side table, floral arrangements still fresh on the dining tables, the projection screen now dark but the memory of the images it had displayed still vivid in her mind. "Thank you," she said simply, looking at each of them in turn. "For hearing me. For seeing me. For helping me reclaim my place in our story." "We should be thanking you," Nathan replied, his voice uncharacteristically emotional. "For having the courage to show us what we were missing, what we were doing without even realizing it." "It was never intentional," Emily added. "We never meant to make you invisible." "I know," Margaret assured them. "And I participated in it too," stepping back, handing over the camera, accepting my gradual marginalization because it seemed easier than asserting my continued importance. "But that's changing now," Ashley said with certainty. "For all of us." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the venue, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with the party itself and everything to do with the journey it represented. The milestone of turning 60 had become not just a chronological marker but a psychological turning point, the moment when she had reclaimed her right to be fully present in her own life. The Mountain View Resort stood silent and darkened as they made their way to the parking lot, the only sound the gentle rustle of pine trees in the night breeze. Margaret paused for a moment, looking back at the building where her reclamation had been so publicly affirmed. Tomorrow she would return to her home with its newly arranged portrait wall. She would continue the process of rebalancing her relationships, of ensuring that her voice and presence remained valued and visible. There would be setbacks and old patterns to overcome, habits of self-erasure deeply ingrained over decades. But something fundamental had shifted, both within herself and in how others perceived her. She had taken down the portrait wall that documented her absence and replaced it with a visual narrative that insisted on her presence. In doing so, she had changed not just the images on her walls but the very story her family would carry forward, a story where everyone's presence mattered, where no one was relegated to the margins, where being behind the camera didn't mean disappearing from the frame. As she got into Emily's car for the drive home, Margaret caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window, a woman in an emerald dress, face lined with 60 years of experience, eyes bright with the knowledge that her journey was far from over. Not just a supporting character in other people's stories, but the protagonist of her own continuing narrative. The portrait wall had been the beginning, not the end. The empty spaces she had deliberately left in the new arrangement awaited fresh images, not just of family gatherings and milestone celebrations, but of her own adventures yet to come. Travels she had postponed, creative projects she had set aside, relationships she had neglected while focusing on everyone else's needs. Ready to go home, Mom? Emily asked as she started the car. Margaret smiled, settling into her seat with the comfortable certainty of a woman who had reclaimed her rightful place in her own story. Yes, she said. I'm ready for whatever comes. Next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.